My name is Mike Snodgrass. I retired after almost 34 years of service to the United States Air Force a few years ago and joined Raytheon. I've lived, fought with, deployed to, and had exposure to 50 different air forces around the planet in my time in the Air Force. I was privileged to have retired as the Deputy Staff IA, and so I have quite a little bit of international experience. What I'd like to do now is alter the discussion slightly. Yesterday we had what would be termed probably a deep dive into some of the more intricate technical details of electronic warfare and how we want to go about promoting our capabilities and improving them across the board. What I'd like to do now is take a much broader look at a more strategic level at what that environment is today, how it has changed over the past, and how that environment, in fact, may influence the decisions that you as senior leaders in your air forces and we in industry now will participate together to try and achieve success on the battlefield. Raytheon is proud to be the lead sponsor of this very important event, and I'm going to offer these thoughts for your consideration on that environment, because we occasionally find ourselves, I believe, struggling to understand the situation that we are in. I'd like to offer some historical perspectives as well, and then hopefully help us all understand the complexity. This slide depicts the neighborhoods of concern from the United Nations Peace Index. As you are probably all aware, the coloring depicts nations which meet criteria for more or less peaceful. It is not our intent to debate this judgment, but clearly the world has a wide range of stable and peaceful governments. Former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, said, "For the first time in a very long time, the United States and its allies are facing the very distinct threats of a conventional state threat from Russia and the unconventional threat of terrorism from extremists." General Dempsey's observation was shared by his replacement for the job, General Joe Dunsford. His assessment was that today Russia presents the greatest threat to our national security. In his testimony to the Congress, General Dunsford expressed his opinion about Russia, and these statements are indications of the recognition, at least by some U.S. military leaders, that the world faces potential stability issues, but their statements should also be viewed in a more historical context, I believe. Some folks in this room, besides myself, may recall threats that the West perceived in the 1960s. Of primary concern was the threat of nuclear war, and the doctrine of mutual assured destruction was discussed for many years during that decade. The goal of the superpowers in those days was to keep any proxy wars under control in order to avoid the threat of a nuclear conflict. It was not a conflict-free period, but a period where nations took steps to ensure clear communications of intent while supporting their allies. During the 1970s, the U.S. stepped back from smaller conflicts, dealt with inflationary pressures, and tried to reorient its military strength. In the 1980s, the U.S. and its allies reinvested in our common defense. At the same time, the threat of nuclear conflict was still on the table, but we had achieved a persistent level of superpower stability over the years, became comfortable with that situation to the extent that we could, and more focused on rebuilding conventional capability. Isolated terrorist attacks occurred, such as in Germany in September 1980. Regional wars still occurred, such as the Iran-Iraq war, and superpowers still engaged in other military activities. Technology drove Western capability increases, and along with reorganizations mandated by our political leadership, such as the Goldwater-Nichols Act, Western nations began, to re-examine their capabilities across a broad range of potential conflicts. When the Soviet Union dissolved and the wall fell, many thought that a time of true and lasting peace was at hand. In the United States, the peace dividend was much discussed in the press for a while. Soon, conflicts such as Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait forced a reevaluation on the part of some as to the wisdom of drawdowns of significant portions of military capability and capacity. In the mid-90s, terrorist activities began to occur at a higher rate against Western interests such as the embassy compounds in Africa. Nuclear conflict was of lesser concern still as Russia and nations to the immediate west of the Urals focused on their economies and improving the way of life. Small, transportable weapons of mass destruction also received some attention from intelligence experts as the post-Desert Storm era began to take hold. In the transition to the 21st century, many observers considered that we had reached a level of stability once again, and although Iraq was contained and Iran was openly hostile to the West, things appeared to be more or less manageable. Some additional terrorist activities were again noted, but not on a large enough scale to entice Western nations to rethink their approach and force structure capabilities. The attacks in the United States on September 11, 2001 changed these views overnight. In a matter of days, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history, and nations began to rethink their levels of cooperation against this new threat in terms of both military and law enforcement activities. Terrorists were actors that were not nations but organizations whose base existed across geographic boundaries. Their use of internet communications and social media in some instances, along with more traditional forms of communication, made their location and intent very hard to discern. Some nations also began to use more economic elements of power to convince trading partners to come to agreement on points of contention. WMD issues became more and more of a concern as terrorist elements became more organized, and their reach appeared to be on a more global than regional scale. Cyber attacks became more and more of an issue as the global internet allowed for greater access to information, but also created vulnerabilities that traditional military planners had heretofore not considered. Global trade, the rapid connectivity from the internet, meant the world was shrinking much faster than it had only a few years prior. In our current decade now, we must deal with the fact that threats once considered individually, decade by decade, or in some instances in small combinations, are now all present at the same time. Terror is now organized on a regional scale or larger, with non-traditional organizations, as it was only a few years ago, but also in a quasi-nation state, as we're seeing with ISIS in Syria. Superpower competition is once again more of a concern of our senior leaders, as we discussed previously, but also not just with Russia, but and also very economically strong China. All this while regional conflict threatens peace and stability, in addition to a resurgence of potential threats of nuclear weapons use. Combined with cyber attacks, threats which we once had the luxury of dealing with one at a time present serious issues, individually and in combination as they exist today. Today it is a fact that these potential sources of conflict exist simultaneously. Each are individually complex and dangerous, but in combination are multifaceted and very expensive to counter. So what can industry do to assist? Industry has somewhat of a luxury in that our leadership in industry is relatively stable, at least as in comparison to our military partners who transition jobs every 2 or 3 years. Continued industry leadership is needed to dialogue with customers to make sure that we both have a shared understanding of the threat and find ways to bring the capabilities needed to bear while learning more and more about this ever increasingly complex environment. We want to help governments to consider the impacts of today's policies on future capabilities. We find ourselves, unfortunately, reacting to situations as this complex environment morphs day after day. And if technology superiority is the key to our future success, then our focus must be over the next 10 to 15-year time period, and it cannot continue to be, as I said previously, reactive only. We believe that working together, industry, military, political leaders need to find ways of supporting our common defense in this ever more complex and difficult environment. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm willing to have a post-discussion now, or I can leave. That would be fine too.
Any questions for Mike Snodgrass then on industry's part?
Mike.
One of the discussions we've been having in Australia recently with our force structure review and white paper, it was going to be white paper 15, but it's now white paper 16, is the role of industry as from an Australian perspective, an eighth fundamental input to capability, as in the defence industry forms a key part of any country's overall defence capability, which we may not have viewed in the past in that fashion. What are your thoughts on that and the ability of industry to actually form part of that fundamental input to capability, if you like, an eighth one?
Well, this is a multifaceted problem as well, because industry has its own approach, and each corporation will have its own approach. It's interesting you asked that question, because the CAF and I had a discussion on this about 6 months ago. It's possible that, given the right environment that you would have to construct, that you could allow industry to come in a free-flowing discussion, knowing that industry will want to be able to bring its very best to you in private, at the same time while having more of a free-flowing discussion about what the capabilities are and what we might do in the future. When I was Major Arnholt's age, we had a very, very close relationship with industry in modeling and simulation, and industry had an incredibly robust modeling and simulation capability. During the 1990s, that capability atrophied, in part because we thought that it wasn't going to be needed because, of course, peace was at hand and we could cancel all of our investment programs long term, but also because it became more and more expensive to do. So the situation we find ourselves today in is that some industry players, like Raytheon, still have a fairly substantial modeling and simulation capability, but a very focused one in individual areas. I think what you're looking for is a little bit broader discussion and communication. I believe that reaching out to industry and saying we would like to shape this discussion to bring you in and have you work together is a possible thing to do, but you've got to set the parameters. In other words, there are certain things that can be shared, certain things that can't be shared, and make industry feel comfortable that they're not going to have a competitive advantage problem down the road because of this common sharing. Not that it's impossible, but it will be something that will require trial and error and discussion to bring people together. Now, if properly motivated and incentivized, industry can do this. And we partner with other industry players on different projects across the board. At times we'll compete with them, our competimates, and at times we will partner with them if it is in our interest. So the challenge will be to figure out how to make it in industry's interest to have that sort of collaboration across the board and what you really want to get out of it. Because the CAF and I have had this conversation, I kind of know where you want to go, and I've fed back to him a couple of ideas on this, but I know that it's at the very nascent stages, and we're willing, and I know all of my industry counterparts here would be more than willing to participate in having some of those one-on-one discussions, as well as perhaps broadening that out to more players. I hope this answers your question, Mike.
All right, yeah. I'm Group Captain Zahid from Bangladesh Air Force, and here, Michael, I'm here.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
There you are.
Group Captain Zahid from Bangladesh Air Force. I'm also currently pursuing a PhD at University of Reading, which gives me a different perspective, and probably I'll be the devil's advocate to pose this question, quite unorthodox though. Following from Ian's lecture, that the air power has been and continues to remain as the most preferred instrument to be used by the politicians. But air power has also two dimensions of using it. I mean, you can also use it as a destruction, degrade, or taking the negative energy out, and also you can use it infusing positive energy, like on humanitarian assistance. Are we in a condition where we are more prone to use air power in its negative role when it comes to degrading, destroying something? And as a PhD student, we always prefer having empirical basis of these facts. Like, are we more quick? What is the time span that we take to make a decision when it comes to bombing as opposed to when it comes to responding to a humanitarian assistance? And from the industry side, what is your time span of developing from a Galton gun to an AMRAAM, or compared to say, a parachute which is capable of dropping large amount of food supplies to humanitarian assistance. I mean, how do you sort of, do you see where I'm going into this? I mean, does this, to give a more human face or to use the full spectrum of the air power's capability, both into its, in taking the things out and also bringing in positivities, how do you have any analysis on that dimension?
If I had answers, my stock portfolio would be a lot greater than it is today, I can guarantee you, because that's a very complex question about how the future might play out. Just let me make a comment, and I'd like to throw it open to the floor for a discussion. We find ourselves in this world that I've tried to describe of all of these different threats and dangers that we've once upon a time focused individually on, now all coming together simultaneously. But at the same time, we still have a very structured process for writing a request for proposal, a very structured process for going out and gathering information, a very structured process for responding to those individual capability needs that our customers ask us for. We don't yet have, I believe, the ability to bring all of this together at once because of the complexities, and I'm not sure that we'll ever achieve that. Industry's timelines and decisions vary by any number of factors, and it would take quite a long time to list all those factors out. There are times that industry can be much more nimble and flexible than I found the U.S. military to be when I was in uniform. There are other times that industry takes very great pains to make sure that the information they provide, the cost estimates they provide, are as accurate as possible to try and gain a competitive advantage, which is the name of the game for industry. So in answer to your hypothetical, I don't have a good answer. I can only tell you that it is still a complex environment and that all of us have to work together to solve these problems.
Time for two more, one on the front hand.
No, not Sweetman. Sweetman doesn't get to ask questions. Go ahead.
Good morning. Wing Commander Andrew Adamson. I'm a RAF liaison officer with the French Air Force. A lot of what we heard this morning has been based on the idea of technological superiority being key to the future. But there's also a lot of evidence that the technology gap is beginning to narrow with state competitors in particular. And I'm wondering what your thoughts would be on how you address that in the future. Are we locked into effectively an arms race for technological superiority, or does industry have perhaps an innovative approach to how we might tackle that closing gap?
Well, the debate on the technology gap and the qualitative versus quantitative decisions that we've made through the 1980s is a debate that will rage on. Again, industry does not have the golden keys of knowledge. But what I will say is a conversation that we had during breakfast. We are very technology focused. Technology gives us great advantages. And we have, in particular, some incredible technologies that we can bring to bear to the fight. And those advantages and those technologies and that investment that industry continues to make to bring those to fruition is a very, very important part. But the other side of it is in my previous life. I strongly believe, I grew up in the F-4, transitioned to the F-16 and did some really great things. The equipment that we give our people must function the way it's designed. But the training that we give our people is more important, I believe, than we're giving it credit for. I would much rather have a squadron of very highly trained F-4 drivers than a four-ship of very, very high technology folks that can't be trained well in that system, whatever that system might be. And I found that throughout my life, that once you have very highly trained forces, then they'll solve problems. Whatever that tactical problem is, whatever that operational problem is, highly trained forces can solve it. So that is my belief on how we need to go forward. All of the discussion that we've had on live and virtual constructive training, I believe, is all very, very good. There are very big issues involved with that we're all trying to solve together. But at the end of the day, whether it's live, virtual, or constructive, highly trained forces will get the problem solved. Yes.
Yeah, Mike.
Bill.
Just for that, should there be I mean, if industry wants to participate in the debate, if industry wants to become a full partner, should there be a different standard for how much industry spends on its own money on research and development versus what industry returns in dividends to its shareholders? Because there's some pretty dramatic differences globally and even nationally within the United States on how much truly independent company-funded R&D different companies do. I'd hold General Atomics up as an example of a company that has spent a lot of money on its own R&D and has consequently been able to shape policy because it's had things ready before the customer wanted them. Is there a case for saying that industry needs to put more emphasis on its own company-funded R&D?
That's your opinion.
Good question.
Thank you, Stephen.
Bye. Thank you very much.